A dark, stormy night, lightning cutting through the sky above a grand mansion where everything seemed perfect, or was it? By dawn, one thing had vanished: Mrs. Amberley. Her love, her fortune, and a secret that could destroy lives. Hercule Poirot was called in, but this time he faced a puzzle more dangerous than ever before. The question wasn't just what happened, it was who would survive the truth. The storm was relentless. Sheets of rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled like a banshee through the dense trees outside, rattling the heavy glass and shaking the ancient walls of the mansion. The flickering light from the roaring fire cast long shadows across the grand, yet lonely rooms. The mansion, perched on the edge of a remote cliff, stood in eerie isolation, its opulent exterior belying the unsettling tension that lingered inside. Inside the drawing room, Hercule Poirot stood with the air of a man accustomed to the most extraordinary of situations. His sharp eyes, hidden behind his characteristic mustache, took in every detail. His presence, perfectly poised and unruffled by the storm, contrasted sharply with the disheveled figure standing before him, Mr. Josiah Amberley. The wealthy businessman was a man undone, his hands trembling, his face pale as he clutched a glass of brandy in one hand, the other wringing a handkerchief in despair. "Monsieur Poirot," Amberley began, his voice barely above a whisper, but urgent nonetheless. "My wife, she has vanished, disappeared without a trace. And with her, a necklace, a fortune in cash, all gone." Poirot's gaze was unwavering, his thoughts moving swiftly like a clock's gears. Amberley's eyes darted nervously about the room, his every gesture betraying the man's fragile state. Yet beneath the anxiety, Poirot sensed something far darker, a secret, locked away behind Amberley's anxious facade. Amberley paced the room, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. She was unhappy, Monsieur Poirot. She was involved with another man, a young fool by the name of Geoffrey. She was going to leave me, I know it. She threatened to disappear with him, but I didn't believe her. And now—" He paused, his voice faltering. "She's gone." Poirot raised a single brow, his mind already churning. "And what of this Geoffrey? What was his role in all this, you suspect?" Amberley's face tightened. "I believe he's taken her. It's the only explanation. He's a scoundrel, a man who would stop at nothing to ruin me." Poirot took in Amberley's words, but a small flicker of doubt stirred in him. Amberley's accusations were precise, perhaps too precise. The detective's sharp mind wasn't fooled by the desperate tone. There was more to this story, something that Amberley wasn't saying. "Perhaps there is more to this than you let on," Poirot said softly, his voice full of measured precision. "But I will see for myself. I shall begin my investigation at once." Amberley, relief flooding his features, nodded eagerly. "Thank you, Poirot. I need you to find her. Find my wife and return her to me before it's too late." Poirot nodded, his gaze now sweeping across the room. The old house creaked with the weight of its secrets. The grand tapestries hanging on the walls seemed to whisper of long-buried pasts, and every step Poirot took felt as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. The detective's mind raced as he observed the finer details. A faint scent of perfume lingered in the air, inexplicably out of place amidst the tension. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he spotted something near the window, a slight disturbance, the faintest trace of an indentation on the carpet, as if someone had been there recently. But what had they left behind? A trace, a clue. And then, a sudden noise broke through the silencia, soft thud, barely audible, but unmistakable. Poirot's sharp eyes snapped to the door. He had not heard anyone approach. No footsteps. No sign of movement. Yet there it was again, a subtle sound, as if something or someone was moving within the house. Poirot's pulse quickened slightly, but his exterior remained calm. He turned back to Amberley. "Excuse me, monsieur. It seems I am not the only one in this house." Amberley, too, looked uneasy, his gaze flicking nervously toward the door. "What do you mean?" I haven't heard anything." Poirot's eyes lingered on the door for a moment longer before he made a decision. "I believe, monsieur, that we are not alone." and the mystery here is far deeper than either you or I imagined." He moved swiftly toward the hallway, his steps light and calculated. Amberley hesitated but then followed, his breath ragged. The sound was growing louder now, footsteps, but there was no one to be seen. Poirot reached the grand staircase and froze. There, at the top of the stairs, a shadow moved just out of view. Someone or something was waiting. "Stay here, Monsieur Amberley," Poirot whispered, his voice firm. He ascended the staircase, each step measured and deliberate, his heart pounding with the anticipation of what lay ahead. As he reached the top, the shadow disappeared, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. Poirot's mind raced. Who was hiding in the house? And what was the truth behind Mrs. Amberley's disappearance? Before he could turn to descend, a loud crash rang through the house, an unmistakable sound, like glass shattering. Poirot spun around, his eyes wild with sudden urgency. What was that? And then, a chilling scream echoed from the shadows at the far end of the hallway, a scream that was abruptly cut short. Poirot's pulse quickened. Something had just gone terribly wrong. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot stood motionless at the top of the stairs, his mind racing. The house had come alive in the most unsettling way, the air thick with tension. The scream had come from behind that closed door. Who was it? What had just happened? Poirot took a deep breath and began to move forward, but as he stepped onto the first step, he heard a sound that froze him in place, a low, guttural whisper, so faint yet unmistakable. Don't come any closer, Monsieur Poirot." His heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded desperate, frantic, and yet it was eerily calm. Who was it? And what did they know? The detective's pulse raced. The mysteries of the Amberley mansion were multiplying by the second, and he had no choice but to follow the sound straight into the unknown. The investigation begins. The storm still raged outside, its fury intensifying with each passing minute. Inside the mansion, however, an eerie stillness had settled over the rooms. The grand halls, once filled with laughter and chatter, now felt like a tomb. Only the occasional creak of the old wood beneath Poirot's polished shoes broke the silence. Poirot was calm as mind, sharp as ever, yet there was something about this place, this house, that gnawed at him. As he stepped into the study, where Amberley had led him earlier, he took note of every detail. Amberley had spoken at length, but it was not the words that Poirot was interested in. It was the things left unsaid, the subtle movements, the fleeting expressions of emotion. "She was unhappy, Monsieur Poirot," Amberley had confessed, his voice trembling with emotion. "She grew fond of that boy Geoffrey, a young man, hardly a match for her, but she was lost. I could see it. She was slipping away from me, and I was powerless to stop it." Poirot watched Amberley closely as he spoke, noting the bitterness that laced his words. The businessman's face was tight, his features drawn with a mixture of disbelief and deep hurt. Yet there was something else in his eyes, a spark of something darker, a shadow that flickered just beneath the surface. "And Geoffrey?" Poirot asked, his voice steady but probing. "How did this Geoffrey fit into your life, Monsieur Amberley? Was he truly the cause of her disappearance?" Amberley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was a man of wealth and stature, but in this moment he seemed fragile, almost broken. "I don't know, Poirot. I don't know." He was a constant presence, always there, always around. And she had started to spend more time with him. They would go on walks, talk for hours, and when she came back to me, she was distant, cold. His voice faltered, and his eyes clouded with emotion. "I confronted her once, you know. She denied everything, but I could see it in her eyes. She was slipping away." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Amberley's pain was evident, but Poirot's mind moved quickly, connecting the dots with his usual precision. The missing wife, the sudden appearance of a young man, everything seemed to fit neatly together, yet Poirot knew better than to rush to conclusions. He had to understand more. What was it that Amberley wasn't saying? And what was hidden in the shadows of the Amberley mansion? Poirot made his way through the large, darkened corridors of the mansion, moving with purpose and grace. His eyes, sharp as ever, caught every detail. The house was in disarray, its former grandeur now tarnished with the dust of neglect. The walls were lined with fine art, but none of it seemed to tell the story of the Amberleys. This was a house of secrets, and Poirot intended to uncover them all. As Poirot stepped into the drawing room, something caught his attention. A window, slightly ajar, the edges of the curtains fluttering in the breeze from the storm outside. The wind howled, but it was the window that felt out of place. It wasn't the draft, it was the fact that the window had been left open at all. Mrs. Amberley had vanished without a trace, yet someone had been inside. And someone had left through this window. Poirot knelt beside it, studying the frame. There was a faint trace of something powdery. He lifted a finger, careful not to disturb it too much. A faint line of white powder, almost imperceptible, like the remnants of something that had been wiped away hastily. His mind raced. What was this powder? And why had it been so deliberately concealed? Mrs. Amberley's disappearance had clearly been no accident, but a broken window, a hidden trace suggested something far more sinister. Poirot's brow furrowed. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they were far from clear. He stood and moved deeper into the room, his gaze sweeping the shelves, the furniture, and then there it was, a small, delicate scent of perfume hanging in the air. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there. Sweet, subtle, and unmistakable. A woman's perfume, likely Mrs. Amberley's. But what struck Poirot most was the way the scent clung to the room, lingering, even though Amberley had insisted his wife had disappeared without warning. If she had left in a hurry, why had she left this mark behind? Poirot's mind spun with the possibilities. Was Mrs. Amberley's disappearance a sudden flight? Or was it a carefully orchestrated plan? One that involved more than just the young Geoffrey. He turned back to Amberley, who was pacing nervously by the fireplace, his hands wringing the handkerchief as he muttered to himself. Could it be, monsieur? Poirot began slowly, his voice calm yet full of a quiet intensity. That Mrs. Amberley's disappearance was not the act of a woman fleeing in fear, but rather a deliberate escape. Amberley's head snapped up, his face contorted in disbelief. What do you mean? She fled with Geoffrey, didn't she? It's obvious, Poirot. Poirot took a step closer, his eyes narrowing with the weight of the realization that had just struck him. But the window, the powder, he paused, letting the silence stretch between them. And the perfume. These things do not add up to a spontaneous flight. They suggest something far more calculated. Amberley's face flushed, his emotions spiraling out of control. No, you don't understand. She was going to leave me, Poirot. Two was too late. I couldn't stop her. But I didn't expect this. Poirot held up a hand, silencing him. He had heard enough for now. He turned back to the room, his gaze scanning every corner, every hidden shadow. His mind was awash with questions. And then suddenly he froze. A sound barely audible, but unmistakable, a door creaking open somewhere deep within the mansion. It was faint, but Poirot's ears had trained themselves for moments like this. Someone or something was moving inside the house, just out of sight. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. The mansion was alive, shifting, hiding something from him. The puzzle was becoming more complex by the second, and the truth was beginning to slip further from his grasp. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's eyes flicked toward Amberley, who was still pacing frantically, unaware of the noise that had captured Poirot's attention. The creak of the door echoed through the hallway again, louder this time, followed by the faintest shuffle of footsteps, quick, light, almost as if someone was trying to hide. Poirot's instincts screamed at him. He took a step toward the door, his hand poised on the doorknob, ready to uncover whatever was hidden just beyond. But as his fingers brushed against the cold brass, a chilling thought struck him. What if this was all a setup? What if Amberley was hiding something? What if the person in the house wasn't an intruder at all? And then, a shadow moved behind him. The suspects. The investigation had entered a precarious phase. Poirot stood in the study, the weight of the mansion's secrets bearing down on him. The more he observed, the more layers of deception seemed to unfold before him. And with each new revelation, the line between truth and illusion blurred even further. Mr. Josiah Amberley, his host, remained visibly unsettled. He paced back and forth in the large room, his hands wringing at his sides as though trying to crush the worry that churned within him. Poirot watched him intently, his sharp eyes catching every twitch, every flicker of emotion. Amberley had been too quick to call Geoffrey the prime suspect, too eager to paint his wife's disappearance in such simple terms. It struck Poirot as convenient, almost too convenient. "Poirot." Amberley's voice cracked as he turned to face the detective. "I want you to understand. I need to find her. I've lost everything, my wife, my reputation, my wealth. This necklace, the money, it's all that remains of a life I worked hard for." His voice wavered, but Poirot was unmoved. The desperation in his tone was hard to ignore, yet it only made Poirot more suspicious. "You mentioned earlier, Monsieur Amberley," Poirot began, his voice calm but measured, "that you confronted your wife about Geoffrey. Tell me, what exactly did you say to her? What did she reply?" Amberley's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Poirot caught a flicker of anger behind his veneer of hurt. "She denied everything, of course, but I knew. I saw the way she looked at him. I was a fool, Poirot, but I can't deny what I felt. She was slipping away from me, and I couldn't do anything about it." Poirot nodded, taking in every word. He could almost hear the tension in Amberley's voice, the defensive edge to his tone. There was something in his eagerness to paint Geoffrey as the villain that unsettled Poirot. Was Amberley trying to distance himself from something more dangerous? Was there something about his wife's disappearance that he wasn't revealing? Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a soft, almost hesitant knock on the door. Amberley turned sharply, his eyes flicking nervously to the entrance. The moment passed, but the unease in Amberley's expression was enough to make Poirot's curiosity spike. Before Poirot could question further, Amberley nodded toward the door. "Geoffrey," he muttered, his tone heavy with disdain. "The young man, the one who thinks he can take what is mine." Poirot turned, his eyes narrowing. He had heard rumors of Geoffrey, but they were nothing more than whispers unconfirmed, like the shadow of a figure in the night. Now, however, he would come face to face with the man. The door creaked open, and a young man stepped inside, a tall, disheveled figure, with an air of arrogance that seemed to fill the room like a dense fog. His clothes were expensive but ill-fitted, his face sharp and young, with a hint of nervous energy that only enhanced the sense of unease he radiated. "Geoffrey," Poirot said with a calmness that belied his assessment of the young man, "I presume you know why we're here." Geoffrey's eyes flickered from Poirot to Amberley, then back again. He shifted uncomfortably, as though the room itself were closing in around him. "I don't know what you're talking about, Poirot," Geoffrey stammered. "Mrs. Amberley and we were close, yes, but I had no part in her disappearance. I was with friends the night she left." Poirot studied Geoffrey closely. The young man's reaction to the questioning was less than convincing. His words, though defensively quick, carried an edge of uncertainty, as though he were hiding something far darker than he was willing to admit. "You say you were with friends?" Poirot asked, his voice smooth like silk, yet underpinned by an undeniable tension. "And yet, no one can seem to verify your whereabouts that night. How curious, n'est-ce pas? A man of your caliber, who claims innocence, would surely have witnesses to clear his name. Yet none have come forward. None but you." Geoffrey's eyes flickered, a telltale sign of his discomfort. His lips tightened, as if to mask something buried beneath the surface, something he feared would be exposed. "I don't need to explain myself to you, Poirot," he snapped, his bravado faltering. "I didn't have anything to do with her disappearance." Poirot did not react to Geoffrey's outburst. Instead, he shifted his gaze to Amberley, who had grown more agitated. Amberley's jaw clenched as he looked from Geoffrey to Poirot, his fingers twitching nervously at his sides. "You see, Monsieur Poirot," Amberley spoke up, his voice tinged with bitterness, "this boy is nothing but trouble, a waste of time and energy. He's the one who seduced my wife, the one who drove her away. I'm sure of it." His anger was palpable now, his face flushed with frustration. Poirot held up a hand, silencing Amberley with a single motion. "Monsieur Amberley, please, we must remain calm. We are seeking the truth here, not more accusations." He turned back to Geoffrey, his expression softening, though his gaze remained sharp. "You claim innocence, but tell me, Geoffrey, why did Mrs. Amberley suddenly disappear? Was she planning to leave him for you? Or was it something more than that? Something we've yet to uncover?" Geoffrey swallowed hard, his throat tight. The air between the three men grew thick with tension. "I don't know anything more than what I told you." Geoffrey's voice cracked, betraying his own growing fear. "She just left, and I don't know where she went. She didn't say anything. Too, didn't even know about the money or the necklace." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Geoffrey's words were beginning to unravel, his anxiety evident. And yet, something about his story didn't add up. A young man in love didn't just abandon the woman he adored without a word, especially not one with such riches and ties. Geoffrey's discomfort told a story that his words did not. Poirot stood there for a moment, allowing the silence to settle over them like a thick fog. It was clear now. Both Amberley and Geoffrey were hiding something. As Poirot took a step closer to Geoffrey, a strange sound broke the tension, a muffled, distant thump that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the mansion. It was a faint sound, but Poirot's trained ears could hear it clearly. Something, or someone, was moving in the depths of the house. Without breaking his gaze from Geoffrey, Poirot asked, his voice low and deliberate, "And what, Geoffrey, would you say if I told you that the answers to this mystery lie not just in your past with Mrs. Amberley, but in this very mansion itself?" Geoffrey's face turned pale, and he stammered, his eyes darting around the room. Amberley, too, shifted uncomfortably, his breath coming faster as the walls seemed to close in on him. Poirot smiled thinly. The game was afoot, and the truth was about to come crashing down. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, the door behind them creaked open slowly, deliberately, as if beckoning them toward a new revelation. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light from the hall. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. Amberley and Geoffrey both turned to face the door, their expressions frozen in shock. Who was this new figure? And what did they know about Mrs. Amberley's disappearance? Miss Violet, the quiet, observant housemaid. The mansion stood as silent and still as a mausoleum, the storm outside beating against its walls like the echo of some forgotten tragedy. Poirot, now firmly entrenched in his investigation, found himself alone in the drawing room. Amberley had retreated to his study, and Geoffrey had disappeared, perhaps to hide, or perhaps to escape the inevitable confrontation with the truth. But Poirot knew there was more lurking in the corners of this place. That's when Miss Violet, the housemaid, entered. She was a quiet woman, reserved to the point of seeming almost invisible. Tall and thin, her movements were graceful, but there was something unsettling about the way she observed her surroundings, with a deliberate, calculating gaze. She had been one of the last to see Mrs. Amberley alive, and her presence now seemed almost like a shadow in the room. Poirot had spoken briefly to Miss Violet earlier, but it had been in passing, when her eyes had seemed evasive, her words carefully measured. He noticed how she avoided looking directly at him, almost as if she feared revealing too much. "Miss Violet," Poirot began, his voice soft but sharp, "I am most curious, you see, about the night Mrs. Amberley disappeared. You were, as I understand it, one of the last to speak with her. Can you tell me what you remember about that night?" Miss Violet's eyes flickered with something fear. Guilt? Poirot couldn't say for sure. She clasped her hands tightly together, but a brief tremor passed through her fingers. She took a deep breath, her lips pressed into a thin line. I remember her being upset," she murmured. She was agitated, as though she was preparing for something, but she didn't say what. She was packing quickly, as though she were running away. I didn't ask her about it. She told me to mind my own business." Poirot's brow furrowed, his mind racing, packing quickly. It was curious, indeed, the sudden urgency. Mrs. Amberley had planned her departure, but had it been voluntary, or was she fleeing something far worse than an affair? But Miss Violet, Poirot pressed, his voice growing softer yet more intense. What exactly did Mrs. Amberley say? Were there any particular words she spoke to you? Anything that seemed out of place? Violet hesitated, her eyes lowering, then glanced nervously toward the door, as though checking if anyone was listening. There was something, she whispered, almost too softly for Poirot to hear. She said, "I must leave before it's too late." Those were her exact words. And then she gave me a look, one that, it was as though she knew something terrible was about to happen. Her voice trailed off, her gaze drifting to the floor as though the memory weighed heavily upon her. Poirot's eyes widened ever so slightly. Before it's too late. This was no ordinary departure. There had been fear in her voice, fear of something far more dangerous than a mere lover's quarrel. Miss Violet's hands twitched in her lap. She was hiding something. Poirot could sense it. But what? Poirot straightened, his mind moving faster than his feet. "And what about the other servants?" he asked, his voice now measured and calm. Had anyone else noticed anything unusual? Miss Violet was silent for a moment, but then she nodded slowly. I think someone else might know more than they've said, but I don't know who." She paused, biting her lip. "I've seen things, Monsieur Poirot, things that don't add up, but I don't want to get involved. I'm just a servant. They'll think I'm making it all up." Poirot's heart quickened. Miss Violet's words had just opened a door to something much darker. There was more to this mystery than just Mrs. Amberley's disappearance. "I see," Poirot said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You are wise to be cautious, Miss Violet, but I assure you, the truth will come to light, with or without your assistance. There is something here. I sense it." The young woman's lips parted in shock, but before she could respond, Poirot's sharp eyes caught something just beyond the doorframe, something out of place. He motioned for Miss Violet to remain quiet, and with the grace of a cat, Poirot moved toward the staircase that led to the upper floor. He had already noticed something odd about the hallway during his earlier exploration of the mansion. A particular door, one that had been locked, had caught his attention. His instincts told him that there was a secret room in this mansion, hidden behind the layers of pretense and mystery. Poirot's hand grasped the doorknob with precision, feeling the weight of the moment pressing upon him. Miss Violet remained motionless behind him, her breath catching in her throat. The tension between them thickened, and Poirot could feel her unease, as though it were his own. The door creaked open, and Poirot stepped into the darkness beyond, his eyes quickly adjusting to the dim light that filtered through a small, narrow window at the far end. The air inside the room was thick with dust, and the scent of something old and forgotten lingered in the corners. But Poirot wasn't concerned with the room's appearance. His eyes darted to the far wall, where a faint outline of a hidden door could be seen, barely noticeable beneath the fading wallpaper. He moved toward it, his fingers tracing the edges of the concealed doorway. With a single, deliberate push, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the heart of the mansion. The passageway was dark, almost suffocating, and Poirot could feel the weight of 1,000 untold secrets pressing down on him. And then, just as Poirot was about to step inside, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "Don't go in there." Miss Violet's voice was a whisper, but it was enough to freeze Poirot where he stood. He turned slowly, his face unreadable. "Why not?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Miss Violet's eyes met his, and for the first time Poirot saw a flicker of raw fear in her expression. "Because," she whispered, "that's where the truth dies." Cliffhanger ending. Poirot stared at Miss Violet, his mind racing, trying to decipher the warning in her words. Before he could speak, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the staircase behind them, signaling that someone was coming. Miss Violet's face drained of color. "You must leave now, Monsieur Poirot, before it's too late." Poirot's gaze shifted to the dark passageway once more, his heart pounding with the anticipation of what lay beyond. What secrets did that hidden room hold, and who else knew about it? The storm outside intensified, the wind howling through the mansion's cracks as if trying to drown out the mounting tension. Poirot knew one thing for certain. The deeper he went, the darker the mystery became. The midpoint. The mansion had become an enigma, its walls heavy with secrets, each more elusive than the last. Poirot's investigation had led him down many twisted paths, but now, in the dimly lit study, he had come upon something that might just be the key to unraveling it all. The old letter lay in front of him, its ink faded, but its message sharp. The paper had been carefully folded, as if it had been kept hidden for years, its contents a confession of sorts. Mrs. Amberley's handwriting was unmistakable beautiful, but each word seemed to tremble with hidden emotion. The letter was addressed to Geoffrey, and its tone was one of raw vulnerability, revealing much more than Poirot had expected. In it, Mrs. Amberley spoke of betrayal not from her husband, but from someone closer, someone she had trusted. She described a financial ruin that threatened to destroy everything she had built, a plan to escape it all, to disappear, to start over somewhere far from the reach of her husband's suspicion. But the more Poirot read, the more questions bubbled to the surface. Betrayal, financial ruin, the desire to escape. Poirot muttered to himself, his mind racing. He glanced at the letter once more, the words seeming to shift in the dim light. But the handwriting is unusual, he murmured. The letter seemed too neat, almost too perfect. Something wasn't right. Was it a forgery? Or had Mrs. Amberley, in her desperation, penned the words of someone else's design? The plot thickened. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he began to piece together the layers of deception. A forged letter could mean someone was framing Geoffrey, someone with enough cunning to manipulate the entire situation. But why? What was their motive? He turned his attention to Amberley's secret dealings. There, in the quiet corners of the study, hidden beneath stacks of paperwork, Poirot found evidence of the man's questionable investment deals that reeked of desperation. Amberley had been in financial trouble, his empire crumbling, and it seemed he had been trying to cover it up. But what if the disappearance wasn't just about a woman running from a failed marriage? What if it was something far more sinister? Poirot stood up, his mind racing with the implications. Amberley had something to hide, but was he the victim or the perpetrator? Poirot had always believed in the simplicity of the facts. But now, with this revelation, the simplicity seemed to dissolve. Geoffrey, the young lover, was not as innocent as he appeared. The web of lies had ensnared everyone, and it seemed Mrs. Amberley's disappearance was only the beginning. Could it be, Poirot muttered aloud, a conspiracy? More than one person involved. His mind flashed back to the first time he met Geoffrey Charming, yet with something off about him. Was it possible the young man had been blackmailed into this? Was he a mere pawn in a much larger game? And Mrs. Amberley, what was she running from? Was it truly just her husband's rage, or had she been forced into this by forces far more dangerous than anyone could imagine? The door to the study creaked open behind him, and Poirot's senses tingled. He didn't need to turn to know it wasn't Miss Violet or Amberley. Their footsteps were different. This was someone else, someone who had been watching him. Poirot turned, just in time to catch a glimpse of the figure disappearing down the hallway, a shadow in the flickering light. But before he could move, the sound of something scraping against the wood reached his ears, a soft rustling. He looked down to see a small, folded piece of paper slide under the door. He walked over, bent down, and carefully picked it up, his fingers brushing against the coarse parchment. The handwriting on the note was hurried, slanted, and barely legible. It read, "Stop now, Poirot. You are getting too close. The truth is darker than you can imagine. If you continue, you will regret it. Leave this case or face consequences you cannot foresee. Who do you think is the real villain here?" The words were a warning, but they felt more like a threat. One meant to rattle him, to throw him off course. Poirot's gaze lingered on the note, the tension in the air palpable. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling through the mansion like a wailing ghost. Poirot felt the weight of those words pressing against him. Who had sent this note? Who was trying to stop him? And why did it feel like they were watching his every move? The stakes had never been higher. Poirot knew that the path forward would be treacherous. There were forces at play here, forces that had already killed, and would likely kill again if he didn't tread carefully. Poirot's gaze turned toward the shadows in the study, as if he could feel the unseen eyes watching him. He folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. His mind raced, but his expression remained calm, his demeanor unshaken. He had been threatened before, but this was different. This wasn't just a case. This was a battle for something much larger. And Poirot never backed down from a challenge. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place, but as always, the truth seemed just out of reach, slipping further into darkness. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous this case became. The question was no longer just about finding Mrs. Amberley. It was about who was controlling this game and whether Poirot could survive it. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot paused, his heart racing in the silence of the study. For the first time, he could feel the weight of the game shifting against him. He had seen the hidden messages in the letter, uncovered Amberley's financial ruin, and found a web of blackmail and deceit that threatened to consume him. But now, someone was watching him. Someone wanted him to stop. Just as Poirot turned to leave the study, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. He whipped around, eyes wide with disbelief. No one was there. The storm outside raged louder, as if in warning. But Poirot knew one thing for certain now: this was no ordinary case. The stakes were much, much higher, and someone was ready to kill to keep their secrets buried. The final act. The walls of the Amberley mansion seemed to close in as Poirot moved through the grand halls with a sense of quiet determination. The air was thick with tension, and the subtle creaks of the old house felt almost like whispers, secrets lingering just out of reach. The last pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but there was something about this case, a lingering sense that the truth was still slipping through his fingers. Amberley's motives. Poirot had always trusted the evidence to guide him, but now, with each passing moment, he could feel the tug of doubt. Amberley's bitterness was not just a product of a failed marriage, it was the deep, festering wound of a man desperate to protect everything he had built, even if it meant destroying the one person he had once claimed to love. The financial ruin was more than a backdrop to the story. Amberley's dealings had dug a hole so deep that it threatened to bury him. As Poirot discovered, Amberley had more to lose than just his wife. There were debts, large ones, that could be paid only through one desperate measure. Had he orchestrated his wife's disappearance to rid himself of a burden, to cover up something far darker? Poirot mused, standing in front of Amberley's ledger. The ink smudged, as if it had been written under duress. Poirot's mind worked furiously, and he couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that Amberley might have been hiding a darker secretone he wasn't yet ready to confront. Geoffrey's suspicion. Then there was Geoffrey, the young lover, the charming but elusive man who seemed to be more than what he appeared. His sudden departure from the scene, coupled with the way he nervously avoided Poirot's gaze, only deepened the mystery. Geoffrey's past wasn't as clean as it seemed. Poirot's discovery of a small hidden notebook had revealed something unsettling: a string of threatening letters, clearly blackmail in nature. But who was behind it? Who had Geoffrey been protecting? Poirot's questioning had become more pointed now, as he probed Geoffrey's every word. "Did Mrs. Amberley truly flee with you?" Poirot asked, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of suspicion. Geoffrey's response was quick, too quick. A slight twitch of his fingers, a hesitation before he spoke, revealed more than his words ever could. Something about Geoffrey's actions, his nervous glances, the tightness of his shoulders, suggested a man who was running, not from a jealous husband, but from something far more dangerous. Miss Violet's connection. And then there was Miss Violette, the quiet housemaid who had seemed so harmless at first, but now seemed to hold all the cards. She had always been in the background, watching the scenes unfold with the silence of someone who knew too much. Poirot's sharp eyes had already caught her subtle movements, the way she lingered in the corners of rooms, how she always seemed to know when to leave just as a conversation got too heated. There were whispers that she had been close to Mrs. Amberley, close enough to understand her every fear, every doubt. But what if Miss Violet wasn't just a witness? What if she were the key to the entire mystery? Poirot's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Miss Violet," he began, his gaze steady. "Tell me, where were you on the night of Mrs. Amberley's disappearance?" The pause that followed was thick with tension. Violet's face remained unreadable, but her eyes betrayed her. A flash of fear, quickly masked, sent a chill down Poirot's spine. He could see it now, the web that connected Violet to both Geoffrey and Amberley. Violet had been hiding something from the start, something she wasn't prepared to reveal. Her connection to Geoffrey was clearer now, and Poirot's mind raced with the possibilities. Had she been part of a larger scheme? Had she been the one who set the wheels of this mystery into motion, manipulating the players like pawns on a chessboard? Poirot's questioning became more methodical, his observations sharper with each passing minute. Every gesture, every glance was now a clue. He carefully analyzed each suspect, pushing them to the edge of their nerves. Each conversation, each revelation added another layer to the mystery. Amberley's anger boiled over, his carefully controlled facade slipping as Poirot probed deeper into his financial troubles. "You speak of love, but it was money that drove you to this, wasn't it?" Poirot asked, his eyes piercing. Geoffrey's defensiveness increased with each of Poirot's pointed questions, his words becoming more erratic. "I didn't do anything," Geoffrey muttered, but his voice cracked, betraying him in a way he hadn't expected. And Miss Violet's silence became more telling than any words she could speak. Her calm exterior, her measured responses, all concealed a mind that was playing its own game. Cliffhanger ending. The tension in the room reached its peak as Poirot's final question hung in the air. Who killed Mrs. Amberley? Before anyone could answer, the mansion seemed to hold its breath, a distant sound, a soft thudicode from upstairs. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his instincts on alert. Something had just shifted, but what? In a flash, Poirot motioned for the group to remain silent. His mind raced as he made his way up the stairs, his footsteps light but purposeful. The rest of the group followed, each of them uncertain, their curiosity piqued. At the top of the stairs, Poirot stopped abruptly. There, at the end of the hallway, was the door to the library slightly ajar. The faint sound of rustling came from within. Poirot knew this wasn't just a coincidence. He motioned for the others to stay back as he approached, every nerve in his body tingling with anticipation. The door creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure hunched over a desk, rifling through papers. The figure turned at the sound, eyes widening in shock. But before Poirot could speak, the figure's hand shot out, grabbing something off the desk and slipping it into their pocket. The figure bolted for the back door, vanishing into the night before anyone could react. Poirot stood frozen, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. The figure's identity had been obscured by the dim light, but Poirot was certain of one thing: the game had just taken a dark turn. And in that moment, Poirot understood the stakes had escalated far beyond anything he had anticipated. A new revelation. Poirot's mind raced with the unraveling threads, each one more twisted than the last. The Amberley mansion had become a labyrinth of secrets and lies, and each corner seemed to hide another deception, another betrayal. As he sat in the study, surrounded by ledgers, letters, and documents, Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unsaid. A piece of the puzzle was still missing, something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. His fingers hovered over a particular ledger, one he had overlooked earlier in the investigation. As he scanned the numbers, a realization hit him with the force of a hammer. Amberley's financial troubles weren't just a matter of bad investments or misfortune. They were a carefully constructed facade, designed to shield something far more sinister. Amberley had been hiding assets, funneling money through a network of shell companies, making it seem as though his fortunes were in decline, all while secretly holding on to vast sums. Poirot's sharp eyes shifted to another set of papers, letters, written by Geoffrey. They were desperate, almost frantic, pleading with some perhaps Mrs. Amberley about a mounting debt, and the threats that had begun to surface. Geoffrey's desperation had been more than just about love. It was about reputation, about being caught in a scandal he couldn't escape. It became clear that Geoffrey, for all his charm and poise, was drowning in a sea of blackmail, and the pressure had driven him to make decisions he couldn't take back. But the missing piece, the one that had eluded Poirot, was right in front of him. Geoffrey and Amberley had both been pawns in a game much larger than either could comprehend. They had been manipulated, their every move calculated, but by whom? The final twist. Poirot's gaze turned from the papers to the figure standing in the doorway. Miss Violet. She had been silent throughout much of the investigation, her demeanor cool and collected. But now, as she stood in the dim light of the study, a strange sense of unease settled in the air. She had always been an enigma, observing, watching, never speaking more than necessary. "Miss Violet," Poirot said softly, his voice steady but laced with something darker. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Her expression remained unreadable, but Poirot could see the flicker of something in her eyes. Fear. Guilt. Whatever it was, it confirmed what Poirot had suspected. She was more than just a housemaid. She was a player in a much larger scheme, someone who had been pulling strings from the shadows, manipulating both Geoffrey and Amberley. "You've been orchestrating everything," Poirot continued, his voice gaining strength. "The debts, the blackmail, the whispers in the hallways. You've been pushing everyone to their breaking point, creating a perfect storm that would push them toward destruction." Miss Violet's face remained impassive, but Poirot's keen eyes could see the subtle tightening of her jaw. She wasn't denying it. Instead, she was bracing herself for the inevitable. "But why?" Poirot's voice softened, a note of disbelief creeping into his words. "Why go so far? Why destroy the lives of those who trusted you?" For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Miss Violet's face. Regret. Shame. Poirot couldn't be sure, but before she could respond, the truth crashed into him like a wave. The mastermind revealed. Poirot's eyes widened, and the pieces suddenly fell into place with shocking clarity. It wasn't Miss Violet who had been orchestrating the entire plot. It was someone far closer to the Amberley family. Someone who had been hiding in plain sight, playing the long game, using each person's weakness against them. The true mastermind, Poirot realized, was none other than Mrs. Amberley herself. It all made sense now. Mrs. Amberley had been more than just a victim of circumstances, had been the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The letters she had written to Geoffrey were not just about love or betrayal. They were about control. Her disappearance had been staged, not as a desperate escape from a broken marriage, but as a calculated move in a game of manipulation. Poirot's mind whirred with the revelation. Mrs. Amberley had played everyone, from her husband to her lover to her own maid. The debts, the blackmail, the false ledsich had been a carefully constructed lie designed to cover up the real motive. She had wanted power, wealth, and revenge. She had used her disappearance as a way to disappear from her life, only to re-emerge when the time was right, when all her enemies had been brought to their knees. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Poirot was about to reveal the truth, a sudden, sharp knock at the door interrupted him. He froze, his heart racing. A chill ran through the room as he turned toward the door, his sharp mind already calculating the possibilities. "Who is it?" Poirot called, his voice steady, though a flicker of unease crept into his words. There was no response, only the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. Poirot's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. Someone had been listening. He motioned for Miss Violet to stay behind him as he moved toward the door, every muscle tensed. His hand reached for the doorknob, but before he could turn it, the door swung open abruptly, revealing an empty hallway except for one thing. A small, blood-stained envelope lay on the floor, addressed to Poirot. Poirot bent down to pick it up, his mind racing with possibilities. What could it mean? Was someone trying to silence him? Or was this the next move in an even darker game? As Poirot opened the envelope, a single chilling line of text stared back at him. "You are closer to the truth than you think, but it will cost you more than you can imagine." His blood ran cold as the weight of the words sank in. The mystery had just taken a darker, more dangerous turn. The climax. Confrontation. The drawing room had never felt so heavy, the air thick with unspoken words, every corner holding a secret. Poirot stood at the center, his eyes cold, but his mind sharp as ever, scanning the faces of the suspects gathered before him. Geoffrey, Miss Violet, and even the elusive Amberley servants all stood there, their fates now intertwined by Poirot's brilliant deductions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "the time has come to reveal the truth. All your carefully constructed lies, your veiled motives, and false alibis have led us to this moment." His eyes flicked over each suspect, lingering on Geoffrey, whose hands trembled in his lap. "We will begin with you, Monsieur Geoffrey," Poirot continued, his gaze piercing. "The supposedly devoted husband, whose loyalty was nothing but a mask." Geoffrey's face drained of color. His carefully crafted exterior faltered as Poirot dismantled his alibi, step by step. The evening Mrs. Amberley had disappeared. Geoffrey claimed to have been at the club, but Poirot had already uncovered discrepancies in the testimony of his so-called companions. His anxiety only worsened with each truth Poirot revealed. "But I didn't kill her," Geoffrey whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't have a choice." Poirot held up a hand to silence him, his gaze moving to the next person in the room. "Miss Violet." "Miss Violet," Poirot's voice rang out. "The loyal housemaid, who appeared to be nothing more than a silent observer. But you knew more than you let on, didn't you?" Her eyes widened, but she said nothing. Poirot had already pieced it all together. The mysterious figure who had appeared in Amberley's life, the one who seemed to be in the background at every moment of critical importance, was no mere maid. She had been manipulating everyone from Geoffrey to Mrs. Amberley. With precision, it wasn't love or duty that had bound her to the Amberley family, was something far darker, something far more dangerous. "You were more than just a servant," Poirot continued. "You were the orchestrator, the one pulling the strings, the puppet master hiding behind your guise of servitude." He turned to Geoffrey. "You were being blackmailed, weren't you? Manipulated into this mess, driven by desperation." Miss Violet's lips trembled as she took a step forward. "I never wanted it to end like this," she murmured, her voice shaking with guilt, but she could not deny the truth any longer. She had been the one to push Geoffrey, to make him believe that the only way out was through dark deeds, including the mysterious disappearance of Mrs. Amberley. Poirot raised his hands, a gesture of finality. And now the truth about Mrs. Amberley's disappearance. It was not a random act of escape, nor a flight from an abusive marriage. Mrs. Amberley knew everything. She knew of your scheme, Miss Violet. Poirot's voice grew colder. She knew you were using Geoffrey, and she was going to expose it. The room seemed to freeze as Poirot's words sank in. Geoffrey, who had been struggling with his emotions, stood up suddenly. She knew. His voice broke. "But she didn't tell me. Why? Why didn't she say anything?" Poirot's lips curled into a small but knowing smile. "Because she had her own plans, monsieur. You were just another pawn. Mrs. Amberley had been scheming from the start. She wasn't the helpless woman you thought her to be. No, she was playing a game of her own." Geoffrey's face fell, his betrayal finally clear. Miss Violet had known all along. Poirot turned to face them, his sharp eyes glinting with the satisfaction of understanding. The Amberley family was built on lies, built on secrets, but no secret stays hidden forever. Resolution. As Poirot explained the intricate web of deceit, the group stood in stunned silence, each revelation more damning than the last. Mrs. Amberley's true motive for disappearance had been rooted in an old family secret, one involving a vast fortune and a devastating betrayal dating back decades. Her disappearance had been a carefully calculated step to remove herself from a marriage that had become a cage. But her escape had not been peaceful. It had been the result of a scheme that involved Geoffrey's secret debt, the manipulations of Miss Violet, and Amberley's desperate attempts to salvage his family's name. Mrs. Amberley. Poirot's voice was laced with quiet regret. She knew how to make herself disappear, didn't she? She used all of you, like pieces in a chess game, and when her plan was set into motion, there was no turning back. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around them as Poirot concluded the investigation, the pieces falling into place in a chilling harmony. Everyone in the room had been part of the web of lies, but the one who had manipulated them all had been the one who seemed the least likely. Poirot's eyes swept over the room one last time, focusing on Miss Violet. You didn't just want to help Mrs. Amberley escape. You wanted to take control, didn't you? You thought you could replace her. Miss Violet's face was pale. Her shoulders slumped as the full weight of her actions bore down on her. I never meant for it to go this far, she whispered. But it was too late. The mask had slipped, and the truth was undeniable. Final moment. With the case solved, Poirot stood silently for a moment, his thoughts turning inward. The door closed behind him as the suspects were taken away by the authorities, their fates sealed. But even as the mystery unraveled, Poirot couldn't help but reflect on the nature of human desires, the lengths people would go to protect their own secrets, to fulfill their ambitions, and to cover up their darkest truths. As he stood there, gazing out the window at the night sky, Poirot's voice echoed in the stillness. In the end, we are all capable of great deception. But it is the truth, monsieur, that always finds a way to surface no matter how deep it is buried. His words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the case he had just solved. But as he turned to leave, the weight of the moment lingered, a sense of unease settling in. The story was over, but the lessons learned would stay with him. After all, in a world of lies, the truth was often the most dangerous thing of all. And as Poirot stepped into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in the shadows, there were more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Who do you think is the real villain here?